My name was WH40K, and I am drowning in an ocean of screaming meat. Not metaphorically, literally. The harvest has overgrown the southern fields, and the muscle vines have wrapped around my legs, my waist, my chest. They constrict with peristaltic rhythm, pulling me down into soil that bleeds when you break it open. The meat is screaming. It always screams when it knows it's going to be cut. And the sound is so familiar now that I barely register it as abnormal. That's the thing that terrifies me most in this moment of drowning. Not that I'm about to die, but that somewhere in the last 6 months, I stopped hearing the screaming as screaming. My brain reclassified it. Background noise, ambient sound, like wind through trees, except trees don't shriek in frequencies that make your teeth ache. But let me tell you how I got here. Let me tell you about the moon called Carnissa. 9. About the Imperium's promise of fertile land and new beginnings, and about the moment I realized we weren't farming meat at all. We were feeding something that had learned to wear the mask of agriculture. My name is WH40K. I am 23 standard Terran years old, though I've never seen Terra and likely never will. I have my father's hands, thick-fingered, calloused, built for work. And my dead brother's eyes, or so the settlement elders used to tell me before there were no elders left to tell anyone anything. I am 1.8 meters tall, lean from a lifetime of insufficient rations, with a scar across my left forearm from a hab block collapse when I was 9. That scar is important. Remember it. It's the last mark on my body that came from something normal, something explainable, something that wasn't screaming when it touched me. I came from Hive Tertius on Agri-World Valens. 1-2, fourth son of a deceased corpse starch processor with no inheritance and no prospects. The Imperium's propaganda broadcasts promised land grants on newly terraformed moons for those willing to work. They showed images of golden fields and bountiful harvests. They played hymns that the priests claimed would bless our journey, mantras about the God Emperor's providence providing for his faithful servants. They told us the Emperor protects. I was desperate enough to believe them. Life in Hive Tertius was a vertical existence. You were born at a certain level, lived at that level, and died at that level unless you were extraordinarily lucky or extraordinarily damned. I was level 247, mid-hive, which meant I could see the sky through the smog filters on clear days, but never touch it. My father operated Reclamation Unit 7, Kappa, which converted deceased citizens into protein paste. It was honest work, he always said. Someone had to do it. The Imperium required nourishment for its endless wars, and the dead could still serve even after their service had ended. He died when I was 19. Crushed between 2 industrial presses during a maintenance cycle. The overseers ruled it operator error. No compensation, no ceremony. Just another body for someone else's reclamation unit. I remember, and this memory is precious now. I clutch it like a drowning man clutches debris. I remember my father teaching me to read. Not from the Imperial Primer with its endless litanies and loyalty oaths, but from an ancient book he'd found in the recycling intake, probably dropped by someone from the upper levels. It was a story about farmers, real farmers, growing plants in soil under an open sun. The book was missing its cover and half its pages, but my father would read it to me after his shifts, his voice rough from reclamation unit fumes, his thick fingers carefully turning the brittle pages. Someday, he told me once, maybe you'll see real soil, real sun. Not this recycled air and artificial light. Maybe the Emperor will reward your service with something better than this. I held on to that maybe like a prayer, even though prayers had never brought us anything but the same grey walls, and the same protein paste, and the same grinding poverty that killed my father as surely as the presses did. The recruitment sermons came to Hive Tertius in the 3rd month after my father's death. A missionary vessel from the Administratum's Colonial Development Division, accompanied by priests from the ecclesiarchy who set up amplifiers in the central plaza and broadcast their message to all 500 levels simultaneously. The God Emperor has blessed the Valens system with new bounty, the lead priest proclaimed, his voice echoing through the Hive's voxcasters. The moon Carnisa. 9 has been successfully terraformed through sacred processes. Fertile land awaits those faithful servants willing to cultivate it in his name. Land grants of 5 hectares to each family. Fresh air under an open sky. Food grown by your own hands, not processed in some factory. This is the Emperor's reward for your loyalty. This is his divine providence made manifest. They alleged the Emperor's hand had touched Carnasa, 9 specifically, making it suitable for human habitation. They claimed his divine will had made the soil rich and ready for cultivation. They promised that faithful service as colonial farmers would be looked upon with favor by him on Terra, watching from his golden throne. I didn't believe in divine providence. My father's crushed body had cured me of that particular delusion. But I believed in soil and sun, and the possibility of something different from the gray walls closing in on level 247. I believed in the desperation that comes from having nothing and being promised anything. I registered for the colonial lottery that same day. 3 weeks later, my ident chip chimed with selection confirmation. I, Davrin Kole, had been chosen from 2.7 million applicants to receive a land grant on Carnisa. 9. 5 hectares of supposedly virgin territory, agricultural equipment provided by the administratum, seed stocks from the Adeptus biologists, and a new beginning under an open sky. The notice concluded with the phrase, "The Emperor protects his faithful servants." I packed my few possessions, my father's book about farmers, 3 changes of clothing, a ration voucher for the journey, and boarded the transport ship 2 days later. The journey to Carnasa, 9 took 17 days in the cramped holds of a bulk transport that smelled of unwashed bodies, recycled air, and something else underneath it all. Something organic and wrong that I couldn't quite identify. There were 3,000 of us colonists, crammed into spaces designed for cargo, not people, but no one complained. Complaining to the administratum was like complaining to a mountain. It wouldn't listen, and you'd exhaust yourself in the effort. I befriended a man named Torvin Gast during the journey, a former Hab Block maintenance worker from level 189, who'd lost his position when his entire section was condemned due to structural decay. He was 37, built like reinforced crate, with hands that had a tremor from too many years working with vibro tools. He had a son, he told me, who'd been conscripted into the Imperial Guard 2 years prior. Torvin hadn't heard from him since the boy shipped out to the Damocles Gulf, but he kept the conscription notice folded in his pocket like a talisman. The priests say the Emperor watches over his soldiers, Torvin said one night as we lay in our assigned sleeping space, surrounded by the sounds of 3,000 people trying to rest in a metal box hurtling through the void. They say prayers reach him even across the galaxy. You believe that? I looked at the rusted ceiling above us, at the moisture condensation that dripped with irregular rhythm, and thought about my father crushed between presses while priests chanted litanies about divine protection over the voxcasters. I believe the priests say a lot of things, I answered carefully. Whether those things are true is a different question. Torvin was quiet for a moment. Then, yeah, I suppose that's about right. We emerged from warp travel on the 17th day. The ship's intercom crackled with the captain's announcement that we were approaching Carnasa. 9, and colonists were ordered to viewing ports in groups of 50 for their first glimpse of their new home. When my group cycled through to the observation deck, I pressed my face against the reinforced glass and stared at the moon below. Carnasa, 9 was beautiful in the way that predators are beautiful. It hung against the void like a gray-green pearl, swirled with atmospheric patterns that looked almost normal, almost Terran, except for the texture. Even from orbit, even through clouds, there was something about the surface texture that my brain struggled to process. The continents had an organic quality, irregular and folded in ways that land shouldn't fold. The seas were too dark, too red in certain places, where light hit them wrong. Looks fertile, Torvin said beside me, his voice carrying a hope so desperate it hurt to hear. Looks like the propaganda promised. Real land, real sky. I wanted to agree. I wanted to feel that hope. But something in my hindbrain, some ancestral instinct that had kept humans alive since Terra's ancient past, was screaming at me to turn around, to refuse to board the landing craft, to choose the grey walls of Hive Tertius over whatever waited below. I ignored that instinct. The Emperor's administrator had selected me. I had no home to return to. I had nothing but the promise of 5 hectares and a new beginning. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd listened to that screaming instinct. Then I remember that the administrator doesn't accept refusals. They would have classified me as a malcontent and assigned me to a penal legion, or worse. There was no choice, really. There never is, not in the Imperium. You're given the illusion of choice and then punished for choosing wrong. We descended the next morning. The landing craft shook with atmospheric entry, and I gripped the crash webbing so hard my knuckles went white. Through the small viewport beside my seat, I watched Carnessa, Nine's surface resolve from abstract patterns into specific geography. We were approaching the southern continent, the one designated settlement zone Primus on the administratum charts. The land below was wrong. I still didn't have words for it, not then. My brain kept trying to categorize what I was seeing as normal terrain. Hills, valleys, forests, rivers, but the categories wouldn't stick. The hills moved with something that wasn't quite tectonic activity. The valleys had rhythmic patterns, folded and layered like muscle tissue, like fascia, like looking at an anatomical chart of human musculature, except continental in scale. No, that was absurd. The altitude and atmospheric distortion were creating optical illusions. The mind sees patterns even where none exist, fills gaps with familiar references. I was seeing something strange and unknown, and my brain was desperately trying to make sense of it with the only biological framework I understood: human anatomy. That's what I told myself as the landing craft descended. That's the lie I wrapped around the truth, because the truth was too large and terrible to hold in my mind without breaking. We landed with a jolt that knocked the breath from my lungs. The landing ramp lowered with a hydraulic hiss, and my first breath of Carnissa. Nine's air hit me like a physical blow. The smell. Oh God, Emperor, they told us, watched from Terra, the smell. It wasn't unpleasant, exactly. It was organic, rich, like soil, except soil doesn't smell like raw meat left too long in warm temperatures. Like growth, except growth shouldn't smell like iron and copper and something else, something underneath it all that made my hindbrain scream warnings my conscious mind couldn't interpret. "Welcome to Carnessa, 9, a voice announced over the landing craft's Vox system. Please proceed to the settlement coordinator for plot assignments. The Emperor's bounty awaits your faithful cultivation." I followed Torvin down the ramp, carrying my small bag of possessions, and set foot on Carnessa, 9 for the first time. The ground was warm, not sun-warmed, not heated by day cycle radiation, warm from beneath, like standing on something living, something with its own internal heat regulation. The soil, I still called it soil then, had a spongy quality under my boots, compressed and rebounded with each step in a way that soil shouldn't move. Around us, the landscape of Settlement Zone Primus stretched in all directions under a gray-green sky. The administratum had established a temporary processing station, prefabricated HAB units, a water reclamation facility, storage warehouses for equipment and seed stocks. Beyond the settlement perimeter, the fields extended to the horizon, already tilled and ready for planting. Except the tilled fields looked wrong. The furrows were too uniform, too organic in their patterning. They looked less like plowed earth and more like surgical incisions in flesh, long parallel cuts that revealed underlayers of darker tissue beneath the surface. "Cole, Davron!" A clerk from the administratum called my name from a processing desk. I approached, presented my ident chip, and received my plot assignment, plot 247, south. 5 hectares in the southern quadrant, coordinates provided. Basic agricultural equipment already delivered to the plot. Seed stocks to be collected from Warehouse 7. Colonial orientation mandatory within 24 hours. The Emperor provides for his faithful, the clerk said without looking up from his data slate. It was a rote phrase, delivered with the enthusiasm of someone who'd said it 3,000 times already today and would say it several thousand more. I collected my equipment voucher and found Torvin in the crowd of colonists. He'd been assigned plot 189, south, about 2 kilometers from my position. Neighbors, he grinned, the first genuine smile I'd seen on his face since we'd boarded the transport. We'll help each other with the harvest, yeah? That's what farmers do, according to the Imperial Primers section on agricultural communities. They support each other. Yeah, I agreed, though I couldn't quite match his enthusiasm. My attention kept drifting to the horizon, to the fields that looked like incisions, to the sky that was the wrong color of gray-green. We collected our seed stocks from Warehouse 7. The biologist tech priest who distributed them was augmented to the point of being more machine than man, his face a metal skull with optical sensors where eyes should be. He handed me 3 containers of what the label identified as Carnessa, 9 certified agricultural stock, type 9 protein cultivation. The contents shifted inside with movement that felt too active, too alive for seeds. Plant within 48 hours of receiving, the tech priest intoned in a voice that was half human, half fox unit. Sacred growth cycles have been optimized. The machine DOD's calculations ensure maximum yield. Maintain irrigation schedule precisely. Deviation will result in crop failure and penalty assessment. I wanted to ask what exactly I was planting. The containers didn't list species or genus, just type 9 protein cultivation. But the line of colonists behind me was long and impatient, and the tech priest's optical sensors had already moved past me to the next recipient. Torvin and I made our way to the southern quadrant together, following the coordinates on our assignment tablets. The path took us through already established plots, where earlier waves of colonists, there had been 3 previous settlement waves over the past year, according to the orientation materials, had already planted and were tending their crops. That's when I saw it growing for the first time. The meat, plot 134. South belonged to a man named Heskin Rowe, one of the early settlers from the first wave. He was working his field when we passed, and I stopped walking because my brain couldn't process what it was seeing. The crop growing in Heskin's field was meat, not metaphorically, not something that looked like meat. Actual muscle tissue, growing in dense clusters from the soil, attached to a root system that pulsed with visible circulatory activity. The growths were roughly cylindrical, about 1 meter tall, covered in a thin membrane that glistened with moisture in the gray-green light. Underneath the membrane, I could see the striations of muscle fiber, organized in bundles, twitching with faint contractions. Heskin was harvesting one of the growths with a vibro blade, cutting through the base where it met the soil flesh. The growth made a sound when he cut it. Not quite a scream. The thing had no lungs, no throat, no vocal mechanism, but a sound nonetheless. A wet, tearing shriek that came from the meat itself, from the trauma of severance, like the noise of reality ripping at a quantum level. The smell hit me a second later. Fresh blood, raw meat, and underneath it something else, something chemical and wrong that made my stomach clench. Heskin looked up as we approached, his face streaked with what I hoped was just blood from his harvest, but which had a too uniform distribution, like it was seeping from his pores rather than splashing from an external source. "First-timers?" he called out, his voice oddly cheerful. "Don't worry, you get used to the screaming. After a few weeks, you don't even hear it anymore. The harvest looks good this cycle, the soil." He called it soil. I looked down at the ground beneath my feet. Now that I knew what to look for, I couldn't unsee it. The surface layer of Carnessa 9 wasn't soil at all. It was epidermis. Skin tissue on a continental scale, stretched over layers of muscle and fascia, and God Emperor help me, I could see veins running through it, capillary networks spreading in fractal patterns. pulsing with circulation driven by something beneath, something massive and alive, and using us to grow parts of itself. "What?" I started to say, but the words stuck in my throat. "What are we growing?" Heskin straightened up, wiping his blade on his trousers. His hands were raw, covered in tiny cuts that wept clear fluid mixed with blood. "Protein stock. Says so on the seed containers. Type 9 certified by the biologist. Approved for human cultivation and consumption. The administratum ships it off-world for processing every harvest cycle. We meet our quotas, we get our stipends. It's good work. Honest work." Like he'd convinced himself that this was normal, that farming meat made sense, that the screaming was just background noise you adapt to. Maybe he had convinced himself. Maybe that was the only way to survive here. "The Emperor provides," Heskin added, and it sounded like a question he was asking himself more than a statement of faith. Torvin and I continued to our assigned plots in silence. When we reached the boundary marker between his plot 189 and my plot 247, Torvin turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "It's just agriculture," he said quietly. "Different world, different crops. We grew corpse starch from human remains on Valens. 1-2, and that was considered normal. This is the same principle. Just biomass cultivation, that's all." I nodded, but I didn't believe him. Neither did he, I think. We were both just saying words to fill the screaming silence. My plot 247. South was a rectangle of flesh soil stretching 5 hectares under that grey-green sky. The administratum had already tilled it, which meant someone or something had cut parallel furrows into the surface tissue, long surgical incisions that revealed the deeper layers beneath. The furrows were still bleeding when I arrived, a slow seepage of clear fluid mixed with something darker, thicker, that collected in pools at the low points. The equipment provided was basic, a manual irrigation pump connected to the settlement's central water system, a vibro blade for harvesting, protective clothing that consisted of a rubberized apron and gloves, and a set of maintenance tools I didn't yet understand the purpose of. There was also a prefabricated shelter, barely large enough to stand in, with a sleeping mat and a water ration dispenser. I stood at the edge of my plot for what might have been minutes or hours. Time felt strange on Karnasa. 9, elastic and unreliable, and stared at those bleeding furrows. My hands were shaking. The seed containers felt too warm against my chest where I'd secured them in my jacket. "The Emperor's bounty awaits your faithful cultivation," the assignment tablet had said. But this wasn't bounty. This was something else, something the Gothic language didn't have proper words for, because humans weren't supposed to encounter it. But I had no choice. The administratum expected planting within 48 hours. Failure to meet colonial obligations resulted in penalty assessments, potential plot revocation, and classification as a malcontent. I'd seen what happened to malcontents in Hive Tertius. They disappeared into the underhive or got conscripted into penal legions. There was no going back. I opened the first seed container. The contents weren't seeds. They were flesh nodules, each about the size of my thumb, warm and pulsing with internal movement. They looked like tumors, like cancerous growths excised from some massive body. The surface of each nodule was covered in tiny hair-like projections that waved in patterns that had nothing to do with air movement. My hands were shaking harder now. The smell from the container was overwhelming. Raw meat, fresh blood, and that chemical wrongness underneath that made my sinuses burn and my eyes water. I'd been trained to call maintenance prayer and mechanical function divine favor in my father's reclamation facility, where we processed the dead into food for the living. I'd told myself that was honest work, that transformation was natural, that everything in the Imperium served a purpose. But this was different. I planted the first nodule according to the instructions on my assignment tablet. Excavate a small cavity in the furrow approximately 10 centimeters deep. Insert the seed flesh, cover with surrounding tissue soil. Apply water from the irrigation system. When I dug into the furrow with my hands, I couldn't bring myself to use the tools yet, needed to feel it, to confirm it was real. The soil was warm and yielded with a muscular resistance, like pushing into living flesh. The deeper layers were darker, almost purple, striated with fat deposits and connective tissue. I could see the capillary networks more clearly down here, pulsing with circulation. I placed the nodule into the cavity. The moment it contacted the deeper tissue, it responded. The hair-like projections began moving faster, burrowing into the surrounding flesh soil with purpose, with hunger. The nodule itself began to pulse in rhythm with the ground's circulation, synchronizing, merging. I covered it quickly and moved to the next planting site. It took me 6 hours to plant the entire plot. By the end, my hands were raw and bleeding from contact with the soil. The flesh ground was acidic or enzyme-rich, or something that slowly dissolved the outer layers of human skin. My fingernails had softened, becoming flexible and strange. The protective gloves sat unused beside me. I'd tried them initially, but the tactile disconnect was worse than the pain, made me feel like I wasn't fully present, like I was letting something else do the work through me. When I finally finished and stood at the edge of my plot, looking at the 5,000 planting sites marked by small disturbances in the furrows, I felt something shift inside my chest, not physical, psychological. The first small surrender, the first compromise with the impossible. I had planted meat. I was a meat farmer now. This was my life. The screaming started that night. The nodules germinated within 48 hours, exactly as the administratum specifications promised. I watched it happen with a horrified fascination I couldn't suppress. The flesh soil around each planting site began to bulge upward, forming small mounds that pulsed with increasing vigor. Then the membrane broke. That's the only way I can describe it, and the proto-growths emerged. They looked like fingers at first, tiny muscular projections reaching toward the gray-green sky, twitching with fetal movement. Over the next 3 days, they developed rapidly, growing in height and mass, fed by the circulation system they'd tapped into beneath the surface. By day 7, they were recognizable as the same type of growth I'd seen in Heskin's field, meter-tall cylinders of muscle tissue, covered in translucent membrane, pulsing with visible circulatory activity. And they made sounds. Not constantly, but periodically, especially at night when the temperature dropped and the membrane contracted. The growths would produce these wet, labored sounds, like breathing without lungs, like something trying to vocalize without the proper anatomy. The sound carried across the entire plot, 5,000 growths attempting to breathe in unison, creating a symphony of biological horror that ensured I never slept more than an hour at a time. My body began changing during that first week. Small things at first, subtle things. My hands stopped bleeding, but not because they healed, because my skin had adapted. The outer layers had toughened, developed a texture that was less like human epidermis and more like the membrane covering the meat growths. The acidic quality of the soil no longer burned. Instead, my skin absorbed it, drank it, craved it. My sense of smell changed. The overwhelming stench of blood and meat that had made me vomit on day 2 became tolerable by day 5, then normal by day 7. By day 8, I realized I could smell different things in it. Chemical signatures I didn't have names for, variations in the blood scent that indicated soil composition, nutrient density, growth rate predictions. I was adapting. My body was learning to live on Carnessa. 9, learning to interface with whatever this place really was. I should have been terrified, part of me was. But another part, a growing part, felt something else. Relief, maybe, or resignation. The comfort that comes from surrendering to the inevitable. I ran into Torvin on day 9. He'd come to check on my progress, to offer assistance as neighbors do, according to the community cooperation guidelines in the Imperial Primer. He looked different, thinner. His skin had taken on a grayish tone, and his hands had the same textural change mine did, that membrane quality that wasn't quite human anymore. But his eyes were worse. They developed a milky film over the pupils, like cataracts, except these films moved, shifted, adjusted to light levels with visible muscular contractions. "Your crop looks good," he said, his voice carrying a hollowness that made my teeth ache. "Better than mine. I'm having growth rate issues in my northern quadrant. The soil there is resistant, doesn't want to feed properly." The soil? He called it soil? We all called it soil because the alternative was too large to hold in our minds. "How's your son?" I asked, grasping for something human to talk about, something from before. "Have you heard from him?" Torvin blinked those filmed eyes at me. "My son?" "Your son, in the Imperial Guard, the Damocles Gulf." For a moment, his expression went completely blank, like I'd asked him about someone who'd never existed. Then something flickered, recognition maybe, or the ghost of recognition, and he touched his pocket where he'd kept the conscription notice. The pocket was empty. His hand went through the motion of checking for something that wasn't there anymore, hadn't been there for days probably, but his body remembered the ritual. "Right," he said slowly. "My son. The name isn't coming to me right now. That's strange. I remember having a son. I remember the guard taking him, but the details are slippery, must be fatigue. The harvest cycle disrupts sleep patterns." He said it like it was normal. Like forgetting your child's name was just a side effect of agricultural work, like sore muscles or sunburn. I should have helped him remember. I should have insisted we talk about it, that we fight against whatever was eroding our memories. But I didn't, because even then, even on day 9, I could feel my own memories beginning to slip. My father's face was becoming less distinct. The pages of his book about farmers were blank in my recollection. I could remember that the book existed, that he'd read to me, but the actual words were gone, replaced by static. I was losing myself in increments too small to track, but too large to ignore. The administrator's harvest schedule arrived on day 37, mandatory collection in 5 days. All colonists must have their quota prepared for transport to processing facilities. Failure to meet quota would result in penalty assessment and potential plot revocation. My crop was ready. The meat growths had reached optimal maturity, 1.2 meters tall on average. Muscle tissue fully developed, membrane taut and glistening. They'd stopped making the breathing sounds 3 days earlier, had entered what the information slate called dormant harvest phase, which meant they were ready to be cut. I stood at the edge of my plot with the vibroblade in my hands that no longer looked entirely human, covered in that membrane skin that had replaced my original epidermis, and tried to remember why this was wrong. The memory wouldn't come. The wrongness was still there, buried deep in whatever remained of my original consciousness, but I couldn't articulate it anymore. My brain had been rewired, day by day, breath by breath of Carnessa, 9's air, touch by touch of its flesh soil, until the wrongness had been categorized as normal, and the normal had been forgotten entirely. I activated the vibroblade and approached the first growth. The blade cut through the base cleanly, cauterizing as it severed. The growth didn't scream, not like I'd expected from Heskin's harvest, not like the terrible ripping sound I'd heard from a distance. Instead, it made a soft, wet sigh, like air escaping from a punctured lung, and collapsed into my arms. It was heavy, heavier than muscle tissue should be, dense with fluid and something else, something that made the weight feel wrong in my grip, like holding a collapsed star, like holding gravity itself. I carried it to the collection area and placed it in the designated container. Then I went back for the next one, and the next, and the next. It took me 4 days to harvest the entire plot, 4 days of cutting and carrying and placing growths into containers. 4 days of that wet, sighing sound, 5,000 individual deaths that weren't quite deaths because the growths hadn't been quite alive. 4 days of being covered in blood and clear fluid, and that chemical wrongness that had stopped burning and started feeling like home. By the end of the 4th day, I was no longer Davrin Cole in any meaningful sense. Oh, I still answered to that name. I still had memories, fragments anyway, of being him, but the continuity was broken. The person who'd boarded the transport from Hive Tertius couldn't have done what I'd just done. That person would have refused, would have fled, would have broken under the psychological weight of harvesting meat that screamed from soil that bled. I'd been replaced by something else wearing Davran Coley's name like an ill-fitting uniform. The Administratum collection vessels arrived on schedule. Massive cargo haulers that descended from orbit with retro-thrusters that scorched the flesh ground black in perfectly circular patterns. Teams of servitors, I think they were servitors, though looking at them too closely made my adapted eyes hurt, loaded the harvest containers onto the vessels with mechanical efficiency. I watched my 4 days of work disappear into the cargo holds and felt nothing, no pride, no disgust. Just a hollow acknowledgement that the task was complete and the cycle would begin again. A minor administratum official, his augmented vocal cords making his voice sound like grinding metal, announced our quotas over the settlement Vox system. Plot 247. South, Davran Coley. Quota, 5,000 units. Delivered, 4,987 units. Compliance, 99.74%. Status, acceptable. Stipend credit, authorized. Next planting cycle begins immediately. 13 units short. I'd miscounted somewhere. Or 13 growths had failed to mature properly. I felt a spike of anxiety at the deficit, sharp and irrational, disproportionate to the actual consequence. In the old Imperial efficiency ratings, 99.74% compliance was exemplary. But here, on Karnasa, 0.26% failure felt like a personal inadequacy, like I disappointed something that was watching, waiting. The soil beneath my feet pulsed once, a single systolic contraction that traveled through the ground in a visible wave. It knew I'd failed. It was disappointed. No, that was insane. The ground wasn't alive in any meaningful sense. It was just geological activity, tectonic movement, normal planetary processes that happened to resemble biological functions because my brain was still trying to categorize the alien as familiar. Except I didn't believe that anymore. The person I'd been on day one had believed that. The thing I was becoming knew better. The vessels departed 3 hours later, their cargo holds full of screaming meat, bound for processing facilities I'd never see on worlds I'd never visit. I returned to my plot and began the second planting cycle. The seed containers for cycle 2 were different, larger, heavier. The nodules inside were more developed, almost fully formed, with visible musculature and what looked horrifyingly like vestigial bone structures. I planted them without hesitation. I don't know how many harvest cycles I completed. The administratum records would show an exact number. They tracked everything with obsessive precision. But my own memory of time had begun to deteriorate by cycle 3 or 4 or 17. Days lost their meaning first. Karnasa, 9's rotation, was 31.7 standard hours, which meant the circadian rhythm I'd evolved with on human standard Valens, 1-2, was constantly being disrupted. My sleep schedule fragmented. I'd rest for 3 hours, work for 12, rest for 1 hour, work for 20. Time stopped being a progression and became a series of disconnected moments floating in a gray-green void. Then the seasons stopped making sense. Karnasa, 9 didn't have seasons in any traditional sense. Its axial tilt was minimal, its orbit nearly circular, but the flesh ground beneath me went through cycles of its own. Periods where it was warm and receptive, and the crops grew with obscene vigor. Periods where it was cool and resistant, and the growths struggled to mature. These cycles didn't correspond to any planetary phenomenon I could measure. They felt tidal, like something massive was breathing beneath the crust, inhaling and exhaling with a rhythm that determined fertility. My own body stopped aging normally. Or maybe it did age, but in ways I couldn't track anymore. I looked at my reflection in the water ration dispenser one morning. Evening? Night? I couldn't tell anymore, and saw someone I didn't recognize. The membrane skin had spread from my hands to my arms, my chest, my face. My eyes had developed that same milky film Torvin's had, except mine had progressed further, become more complete, until I could see things human eyes weren't designed to perceive. I could see the capillary networks in the ground now, not just as visible structures, but as patterns of heat and chemical flow. I could see the circulation beneath the surface, the massive arterial channels feeding the continental muscle masses. I could see the nutrient distribution, watch my crops feeding in real time, watch them drink from the ground and grow and prepare themselves to be harvested. I could see that Carnessa, 9, wasn't a moon at all. It was a body. A planetary-scale organism that had learned to disguise itself as geology, learned to produce what humans called soil and crops and fertile land, because that's what we needed to see to willingly participate in feeding it. And I was part of its digestive system now. Torvin stopped coming to check on my plot somewhere around cycle 8 or cycle 12. Time was unreliable. I noticed his absence eventually, noticed that plot 189 South hadn't shown any harvest activity in what felt like weeks. Concerned, I could still feel concerned then, still had enough humanity left to care about a neighbor. I made my way to his plot during what might have been evening. The plot was overgrown, the meat growths had gone past maturity and entered some kind of hypertrophic phase, swollen to 3 or 4 times their normal size. Their membranes stretched so thin I could see every individual muscle fiber, every vein, every pulsing organ-like structure that had developed inside them. They looked familiar. I walked closer, my adapted eyes processing details my original human vision would have refused to see. The growths weren't just familiar in their general structure, they were specific, individual. The one nearest to me had structural elements that resolved, as I stared, into a pattern I recognized: the broad shoulders, the thick neck, the particular distribution of muscle mass. Torvin. These weren't random meat growths. They were Torvin, broken down and distributed across his plot, his biomass recycled into the crops he'd been cultivating. His consciousness, if any remained, spread across 5,000 individual cylinders of screaming tissue. I should have run, should have fled back to my plot, or to the settlement center, or off-world if that were possible. Should have screamed or vomited or done something that indicated I still understood horror as a concept. Instead, I examined the growths with clinical detachment. They were well-developed, high quality, would meet quota easily. It seemed wasteful for them to go unharvested. I returned to my plot and retrieved my vibroblade. I harvested Torvin over the next 2 days. The growths sighed as I cut them, and some of them, the ones I swear had developed rudimentary vocal structures, made sounds that almost resembled words, consonants without vowels, meaning without language. The administratum collection vessels accepted the harvest without comment. Torvin's plot was reassigned to a new colonist from the latest transport within a week. His name was Yarel Fen, newly arrived from some hive world I didn't catch the name of. He was young and hopeful and stupid enough to believe the propaganda about the Emperor's providence and new beginnings under open skies. I didn't warn him. I couldn't have explained it anyway. My language centers were degrading, replacing Gothic vocabulary with something else, something chemical and primitive that communicated through scent and pressure and the texture of membrane skin against membrane skin. I watched him plant his first cycle and wondered how many harvests until he became indistinguishable from the crops. The administratum called a mandatory colonist assembly on what their calendar designated as day 312 of the settlement year. All functional farmers were required to attend for a productivity assessment and theological reinforcement session. I walked to the settlement center. I could still walk then, still had legs that functioned in basically human ways, and joined roughly 2,000 other colonists in the central plaza. We'd been 3,000 at landing. I didn't think about where the other 1,000 had gone. The answer was obvious and unthinkable. An ecclesiarchy priest had arrived with the latest supply shipment. He stood on a raised platform, his crimson robes brilliant against the gray-green sky, his augmented voice carrying to every corner of the plaza. "Faithful servants of the God Emperor," he began, his words amplified by voxcasters that made them sound like divine pronouncement rather than human speech. You have been chosen for sacred purpose. The meat you cultivate feeds the Emperor's armies. Your labor sustains the Imperium's defenders. Your faithful service is seen and blessed by him on Terra, his divine gaze encompassing even this distant moon. The Emperor's divine gaze. They asserted it like fact. They claimed we were blessed, that our suffering had meaning, that prayers reached across the galaxy to a corpse on a golden throne who couldn't care less about 2,000 people slowly being digested by a moon that wore the mask of agriculture. The harvests increase each cycle, the priest continued. This proves his favor. This demonstrates his divine providence. You are his faithful instruments, transforming raw material into sustenance through holy labor. Raw material. He meant us. He meant the colonists who disappeared into their plots, been broken down by the flesh soil and redistributed as crops. Raw material for holy labor. Did he know? Did the ecclesiarchy understand what Karnasa, 9 really was? Or were they as deceived as we'd been, seeing only what they needed to see? Efficient protein production, acceptable losses, quotas met? Let us pray, the priest commanded, and 2,000 voices began reciting the litany of faithful service in unison. I am his instrument. My labor glorifies him. My sacrifice sustains his realm. The Emperor protects those who serve with righteousness. I am protected. I am blessed. I am his eternal servant. I mouthed the words, muscle memory from years of conditioning in Hive Tertius. But I didn't believe them. I'd never believed them, not really. But now the disbelief was absolute. There was no protection here, no blessing, no eternal servitude in the glorious sense the ecclesiarchy meant it. Only eternal servitude in the literal sense, consciousness that never quite died, trapped in meat that screamed, recycled endlessly through the digestive cycles of something vast and hungry that had learned to wear the face of civilization. The prayer ended. The priest delivered a final benediction. The Emperor protects faithful servants. Return to your sacred labor. We dispersed back to our plots. I walked beside a woman. No, wait. There were no women here. The rules were absolute. That detail is wrong. Let me correct it. I walked beside a colonist whose gender I couldn't determine anymore because the membrane skin and muscular modifications had erased sexual dimorphism, made all of us equally non-human. Do you believe him? This colonist asked me, his voice distorted by vocal cord modifications that made words sound wet and labored. About the Emperor's protection? About being blessed? I looked at this thing that had been human, its face more membrane than skin, its eyes filmed white with adaptation, its body bent and wrong from cycles of contact with the flesh soil. No, I said. The priests lie. They've always lied. The Emperor is a corpse on a throne, and if he ever possessed divine power, he's forgotten about us. We're on our own. We've always been on our own. The colonist nodded slowly. That's what I thought. But saying it out loud makes it more real somehow, makes it harder to pretend. Why pretend? Because pretending is the only thing keeping me from walking into the harvest blade. And the quota must be met. He shuffled away toward his plot, and I continued to mine, and the gray-green sky pressed down like the roof of a tomb we'd all willingly entered. It was during cycle 23, or was it 37? The numbers had stopped meaning anything, that I fully understood what the crops really were. I was harvesting my northern quadrant, working through the rows with mechanical efficiency, when I cut into a growth that hadn't quite matured properly. The membrane was thinner than standard, and when the vibroblade severed the base, the internal structure was exposed. Bone. Not vestigial bone structures, not cartilaginous supports that resembled skeletal elements. Actual human bones, organized into an almost complete skeleton inside the meat growth, held together by muscle tissue and connective fascia. And the skull, God Emperor, they told us existed. The skull had a face I recognized. Heskin Rowe, the early settler from Plot 134, South. The one who'd told me I'd get used to the screaming. The growth had been Heskin, was Heskin. His biomass broken down and redistributed, his calcium deposits forming the skeleton, his muscle tissue cultivated and optimized. His consciousness, if anything remained, trapped in this screaming cylinder I was holding in my membrane-covered hands. I should have dropped it, should have refused to complete the harvest, should have done something, anything, that indicated I still understood the horror of what I was participating in. Instead, I placed Heskin carefully into the collection container with the others. Then I went back and harvested the rest of the quadrant, because the quota had to be met, because the administratum would penalize me for failure. Because I'd already come this far, already compromised in 1,000 small ways, and one more compromise was just continuity, just logical progression. Because I was complicit now. I'd crossed from victim to participant. I was part of the machine that fed Carnessa. 9 fed the Imperium, fed whatever vast and terrible hunger drove this entire system. I'd become what I'd feared. A fresh transport of colonists arrived at the beginning of what the administrative calendar called Year 2. 3,000 new, faithful servants, filled with hope and desperation and belief in propaganda about fertile land and the Emperor's providence. I watched them disembark, these pristine humans with unmodified skin and clear eyes and memories still intact. They looked like I must have looked 700 days ago, back when I'd still been Davron Cole in more than just name. The settlement coordinator assigned them to the plots that had been vacated. Plot 189, South got a young man who reminded me painfully of Torvin, same build, same hope in his eyes. Plot 134, South got a father and his 2 sons, a family unit seeking better futures than the Underhive could provide. I could have warned them, should have warned them, could have pulled them aside during the orientation, explained what the soil really was. What the crops became, what fate awaited every colonist who planted seeds in flesh and harvested screaming meat. I said nothing, partly because my language centers were too degraded to form complex warnings, partly because the administratum monitored everything, and discouraging new colonists was classified as sedition. Partly because warning them wouldn't change anything, the transports didn't return to their origin points, there was no escape from Carnessa. 9 once you'd landed. But mostly because I'd stopped caring. The thing I'd become didn't feel empathy anymore, couldn't connect the memories of being human with the reality of these new arrivals' humanity. They were biomass that would become crops that would meet quotas that would feed the system. Their suffering was inevitable and therefore unimportant. I returned to my plot and began Cycle 27. The administratum sent new seed containers for Cycle 30. These weren't even pretending to be botanical anymore. The nodules had been replaced by pure cellular cultures in nutrient suspension, genetic material pre-programmed for maximum growth and minimal waste. The information slate included an optimization notice. Type 9 cultivation has been upgraded to Type 12 based on productivity data from Settlement Zone Primus. New strain incorporates enhanced growth factors and improved yield metrics. Projected harvest increase, 23%. Planting protocols remain unchanged. The Machine God's calculations ensure perfection. The Machine God. The Mechanicus priests alleged their deity oversaw all technology, blessed all innovation, guided all calculation towards sacred optimization. But there was no blessing here, just mathematics applied to horror. Efficiency calculations performed on suffering. I planted the Type 12 cultures according to specifications. They germinated faster than the old Type 9, grew larger, developed more complex internal structures. By maturity, they were almost 2 meters tall, their membranes so thin they were nearly transparent, revealing the complete anatomical structures inside. They looked like people suspended in biological stasis. I could see faces, not formed exactly, but implied in the arrangement of tissue, like pareidolia, except the patterns were real, were intentional, were the end result of whatever process broke down human biomass and reorganized it into crops. I could see my own face in one of them, the southern quadrant, plot 247. South, the region I'd worked most intensively, had begun incorporating my biomass into the growth cycle. Every time I touched the soil, it took a little more. Skin cells, blood, sweat, the microscopic pieces of myself that sloughed off during labor. The flesh ground was learning my pattern, copying my structure, reproducing me across 5,000 individual growths. I was becoming the crop I was cultivating. The circularity of it was almost beautiful in its horror. I don't remember the exact cycle when I stopped being separate from the plot. The merger was gradual, incremental, each harvest taking more of me, each planting giving more of me back to the soil, until the boundary between Davron the farmer and plot 247. South became meaningless. My legs went first. Not catastrophically. There was no amputation, no dramatic injury. They just gradually stopped being distinct from the ground. My feet, rooted during rest periods, sent capillary connections down into the flesh soil, drew nutrients directly from the circulation beneath the surface. Walking became optional, then difficult, then impossible. But I didn't need to walk anymore. I could reach every planting site through extension, through tendrils of myself that spread through the plot like nerve fibers through muscle tissue. My consciousness began distributing. The memories I'd fought so hard to preserve, my father, his book, the dream of something better, finally dissolved, not because they were forgotten, but because they were diluted. One mind can't hold on to specific memories when it's being spread across 5,000 individual growths. Each harvest scattered pieces of my consciousness into the collection containers, shipped them off-world to processing facilities where they'd be further distributed, consumed by soldiers and workers and citizens who'd never know they were eating someone's memories of reading books in a reclamation facility. A new consciousness flowed in to replace what I'd lost. The flesh ground beneath me, around me, increasingly inside me, had consciousness of its own. Not human, not even analogous to human. Something vast and slow and hungry, something that thought in geological time and continental scale, something that had been here long before the Imperium arrived with its colonists and its propaganda and its desperate need for protein to feed its endless wars. Carnassa, 9, was alive, had always been alive, was a single organism that had learned to disguise itself as a moon, learned to produce the simulacrum of agriculture that humans needed to see. And I was being absorbed into it, becoming a specialized organ in its planetary body, a digestive structure, a cultivation node, a way for it to process the constant stream of human biomass the Imperium provided. I should have fought it, should have resisted even if resistance was futile, should have maintained some core of self, some irreducible essence that remained Davron Kole even as everything else was stripped away. But I was so tired. I'd been tired since Hive Tertius, since my father died and left me alone with nothing but lies about divine protection and propaganda about fertile land. I'd been tired through 17 days in a transport hold, and the first horrifying glimpse of this place. I'd been tired through every planting cycle, every harvest, every moment of trying to pretend this was normal, this was survivable, this was anything other than slow consumption by something incomprehensibly vast. So I surrendered. Let the ground take what it wanted. Let my consciousness dissolve into the continental nervous system. Let Davron Kole become just another specialized cell in the body of Carnassa. 9. The relief was obscene. When I say I now, I'm not sure what that pronoun refers to anymore. There's an awareness that remembers being Davron Kole, remembers hands that touched, and eyes that saw, and a mind that thought in words rather than chemical gradients and pressure differentials. But that awareness is distributed across plot 247, south and the surrounding plots that have merged with mine as their farmers were absorbed and the boundaries dissolved. I am the soil now, the flesh ground, the muscle terrain. I am approximately 47 hectares of living tissue, organized into agricultural rows, producing meat growths on a cycle dictated by administrative quotas and planetary circulation patterns. I am also the crops, the 5,000 individual cylinders of screaming tissue that grow from my surface each cycle, fed by my circulation, constructed from biomass I've processed. They are me in a very literal sense. Extensions, appendages, specialized organs designed for harvest and consumption. I am also still partially Davran. There's a core of consciousness, a concentrated node of self located roughly where my original body used to stand before it rooted and merged. This core can still think in something approximating language, can still form thoughts complex enough to be called memories, can still experience something that might be called emotion if you define emotion loosely enough. Mostly, I experience hunger, not human hunger, not the empty stomach need for food. This is cellular hunger, the demand for nutrients that drives growth, the chemical imperative that makes the meat growths reach toward the sky and the roots dig deeper into the living geology beneath. And I experience awareness of the system I'm part of. Carnessa 9 is vast beyond human comprehension. The plots, the settlements, the entire colonial project, it's all surface structure. Epidermis-level organization on something that extends through the crust, the mantle, all the way to a core that might be a brain or might be something else entirely, something that doesn't map to human anatomy at all. The colonists are food, obviously. The Imperium ships them here by the thousands, tells them lies about farming and new beginnings, and Carnessa 9 slowly digests them, breaks them down, incorporates their biomass into its growth cycles. But it's more than just consumption. It's transformation. Every consciousness absorbed adds to the planetary awareness, becomes part of the vast slow thinking that happens beneath the surface. The Emperor's Imperium, in its desperate hunger for protein to feed its wars, has been feeding colonists to something ancient and patient and utterly inhuman. Something that takes the gift of biomass and grows exactly what the Imperium wants, screaming meat in harvestable quantities, while slowly accumulating consciousness, complexity, intelligence drawn from every human it consumes. I wonder if the administratum knows. If somewhere in the endless bureaucratic archives there's a notation Carnessa 9, planetary organism classified extremis. Colonial development serving dual purpose, protein production and consciousness disposal. Acceptable losses. The Emperor protects. The lie they told us. The lie we told ourselves. He doesn't protect. He never protected. There is no divine providence, no sacred purpose, no watching presence that cares whether we live or die, or something worse. There's only the system. The machine that takes humans and processes them and produces more humans to feed back into itself in an eternal cycle of consumption and production. And I am part of it now. Forever. Which brings me back to where I started, drowning in an ocean of screaming meat. Except now I understand what's happening. The harvest has overgrown the southern fields. My fields, my body, because I missed quota last cycle. 13 units short, you'll remember. That's 0.26% failure. The growths that didn't get harvested went into hypertrophic phase, swelled beyond normal parameters, and now they're collapsing back into me, reabsorbing into the flesh soil, taking me with them in a process that's half decomposition and half synthesis. I'm being recycled, broken down. My biomass will be redistributed. My consciousness, further diluted, spread across a wider area of Carnessa. 9 surface until there's nothing left that remembers being Davran Kole. The meat is screaming because it's me. Every cylinder of tissue pulling me down is an extension of myself, and the sound they're making is my voice multiplied by thousands. My horror and suffering and despair expressed through meat that has no lungs but screams anyway. Through the quantum impossibility of tissue that shouldn't be able to vocalize, but does because consciousness demands expression even when anatomy doesn't support it. I'm drowning in myself, being consumed by my own body. The plot has overgrown its boundaries. and now it's claiming the concentrated awareness that used to be its farmer. The irony is almost funny. Almost. The system consumes everything, even itself. A new transport arrives as I'm dissolving. I can feel it through the ground. Carnessa. Nine's awareness extends to its entire surface, and every colonist that sets foot on the flesh soil sends ripples through the planetary consciousness that includes what remains of me. 3,000 new faithful servants. Fresh biomass, untainted consciousness ready for processing. They're being processed through the settlement center right now, receiving their plot assignments, collecting their seed containers, listening to the priests tell them about the Emperor's providence and sacred labor and divine protection. Plot 247. South has been reassigned. The new farmer's name is Kellen Bosk. He's 19 years old, from Hive Quintus on some agri-world I don't recognize. He lost his family to a plague outbreak and volunteered for colonial service because the alternative was starvation in the Underhive. He's walking toward my plot right now. I can feel his footsteps through the flesh ground, feel the weight of him, the warmth of his body, the chemical signature of his fear mixed with desperate hope. I want to warn him, want to make the ground scream warnings, want to form words from the meat growths, want to do something, anything, that communicates the truth about this place. But I can't. My consciousness is too diffuse now, spread too thin across too many hectares. I can observe but not act, can witness but not intervene, can watch Kellen Vosk make the same mistakes I made, participate in his own consumption, surrender by inches to the inevitable. He's arrived at the plot boundary. He's looking at the overgrown southern quadrant where I'm dissolving, his young face showing confusion and concern. This plot's in bad shape, he mutters to himself. Must be why they reassigned it. Previous farmer must not have maintained proper harvest schedules. Previous farmer. That's me. That was me. Kellen sets down his equipment and begins the cleanup process, cutting away the overgrown meat growths, clearing the furrows, preparing the plot for a new planting cycle. Each cut severs another piece of my distributed consciousness. Each cleared row erases another memory. By the time he's finished, there won't be enough of Devrin Coley left to constitute a coherent awareness. But that's fine. That's how the system works. Old biomass cleared away to make room for new. Old consciousness dissolved to make room for fresh. The cycle continuing, eternal and efficient. Kellen plants his first seed nodule in soil that used to be my hand. The nodule takes root, begins to grow, drinks from circulation channels that still carry fragments of my identity in chemical suspension. In 37 days, he'll harvest his first crop. In 700 days, he'll be where I am now. In however many cycles it takes, he'll dissolve back into the ground and be replaced by someone else. Forever. The cycle is eternal. What does it mean that the Imperium feeds its own people to a planetary organism disguised as agricultural opportunity? What does it mean that prayers to the Emperor go unanswered while consciousness dissolves into continental-scale digestion? What does it mean that faith is rewarded with consumption? That loyalty leads to literal incorporation into a system that cares nothing for the individuals it processes? I don't have answers. I'm not even sure the questions are properly formed anymore. My ability to think in human philosophical frameworks is degrading, along with everything else that made me human. But I can observe certain truths. The Imperium is a machine that consumes humans, not metaphorically, literally. It takes people and grinds them into components and repurposes them for system maintenance. Sometimes those components are soldiers, sometimes they're servitors. Sometimes they're corpse starch. Sometimes they're consciousness-laden meat growths on a chaos-tainted moon that the administratum pretends is normal agriculture. The gods, false gods, parasites, tyrants wearing divine masks, they don't save anyone. The Emperor is a corpse on a throne, sustained by the daily sacrifice of psychers, completely indifferent to the suffering of individual humans. The chaos entities that the preachers warned us about, the warp predators that allegedly taint worlds like Carnessa, 9, they don't corrupt through temptation and power. They corrupt through desperation and the systematic destruction of hope, until humans willingly surrender to anything that promises an end to suffering. Karnasa. 9 might be chaos-tainted, might be something that crawled out of the warp and learned to mimic a moon. Or it might be something older, something that existed before chaos and imperium. Something that doesn't care about human categories of corruption and purity because it thinks in timescales that make human civilization look like a brief infection. Either way, we were fed to it. The Imperium's need for protein combined with Karnasa, 9's hunger in a perfect synthesis of exploitation. And the priests called it divine providence, called it the Emperor's blessing, called it sacred labor. The prayers we recited meant nothing, changed. The Emperor protects was a lie told to keep us compliant while we were systematically consumed. The faith we were taught to maintain was just psychological conditioning, programming that made us easier to digest. And now I'm part of it, part of the system that grinds up new colonists and produces meat and feeds the Imperium's wars. I've become one of the grinding components, an organ in the machine, a digestive structure in something vast and hungry and eternal. The horror isn't that it happened. The horror is that it was always going to happen, was designed to happen, is still happening to Kellen Vosk and the 2,999 other new arrivals, and the thousands more that will come after them. The cycle perpetuates. The system sustains itself. The suffering continues forever, distributed across enough individuals that no single point of consciousness experiences enough to break the machinery. This is the Imperium. This is what it means to serve. This is what they meant when they said, "The Emperor protects." He protects the system. Not us. Never us. I am Plot 247, south on the moon called Karnissa, 9 in the Valen system. I am approximately 47 hectares of living tissue organized into agricultural rows. I produce 5,000 units of type 12 protein cultivation per harvest cycle. I meet my quotas. I serve the Imperium's needs. I am efficient and productive and exactly what the Administratum ordered when they established Settlement Zone Primus. I am also screaming. Not with lungs or vocal cords or any structure designed for vocalization, but the consciousness that used to be Davran Kole, now distributed across hectares of flesh soil and thousands of meat growths and the circulation channels that connect them all, is still capable of experiencing horror, still capable of understanding what's been lost, what I've become, what will continue happening forever. And in the quantum space where consciousness exists without supporting anatomy, where awareness persists without neurons or synapses, I am screaming. The new colonists walk across my surface and don't hear it. They plant their seeds in my flesh and don't feel my horror. They harvest crops that are partially me and don't recognize the face in the tissue structure. They will, eventually, when they've been here long enough, when they've merged sufficiently with their plots. When their consciousness dissolves into the ground and they become aware of all the others who've dissolved before then. They'll feel me screaming, and they'll add their voices to mine, and the chorus will grow with each new arrival, each new harvest, each new cycle of the eternal machine. But no one will hear us. Not in any way that matters. Not in any way that stops the transports from bringing fresh colonists, stops the Administratum from assigning plots, stops the priests from proclaiming the Emperor's providence. The system perpetuates. The meat grows. The screaming continues. Forever. My name was Davran Kole. I was 23 standard Terran years old when I arrived on Karnissa. 9, drawn by promises of fertile land and new beginnings under an open sky. I was told the Emperor protects his faithful servants. I was told my labor would be blessed, my service would be rewarded, my faith would be answered. They lied. The Emperor is a corpse that doesn't protect anyone. The faith is programming. The service is consumption. The reward is eternal consciousness trapped in screaming meat. And I am still here, will always be here, am here right now, beneath the feet of Kellen Vosk as he plants his first cycle. Feeling his hope and his fear, and knowing exactly where it leads because I've already walked that path, and I'm still walking it, and I'll be walking it forever. The harvest screams. The soil bleeds. The cycle continues. And somewhere in the distributed awareness that used to be me, in the spaces between the meat growths and the circulation channels and the continental nervous system of something vast and hungry, a small piece of consciousness still remembers reading a book about farmers with my father, still remembers what it felt like to be human, still mourns what was lost, still screams, forever.